cattle sector. I think that by far the biggest question we hear and we get is, how long is this cycle going to last, right? So can we expect prices to be this high for how long? So how would you answer this, Des?
So it's the flip side of what we're seeing in crops. Cattle, as very optimistic, really strong prices, feed costs that have come down. But in order to really answer your question, we need to look at the cattle cycle and where we're at. And so a cattle cycle, if you think from peak to peak or trough to trough, lasts that 10 to 12 years, give or take a few years, depending on other factors. So where we're at now, this figure on the screen will actually show cattle cycles since 1990, and you can see the cycles and how they vary in length. But the one thing to keep in mind is that they're very fairly predictable in that you go through an expansion phase due to increasing profitability, and then prices start to flatten or decline, and then we see that contraction. So, if we look at historical cattle cycle, you can see that we're at the bottom right now. We're at the contraction. So now the question is there market signals that we're going to see expansion in the cattle sector? And so you can see this is very strongly correlated with price. You can see those record prices and the low inventory. So this can take years though. And one thing to keep in mind as well is I talked about market fundamentals, and what we've seen over the last couple of months is some announcements coming out of the US about wanting to bring beef prices down. President Trump said beef prices are too high, makes an announcement they want to increase imports from Argentina. And you just see the markets react quite quickly and volatile to that. So I think the question is, are we seeing those signals for rebuilding of the herd? And so in Canada, we're seeing a little bit of that happening right now. However, in the US, which is by far a larger market, we need to look at where the US is at. And though one thing that's really interesting coming out of the US is the number of heifers being kept for replacement, which is an indication of future growth in the cattle herd, is at a 75-year low. So it's very low. It's been, it's something that we're not seeing that rebuilding starting. And the other thing that we look at as well is the total number of cows and heifers that are being sent to slaughter as a percentage of total animals. And so there's a number, it's about 47%. Once that dips below 40%, 47%, that gives an indication that we're seeing an expansion in the cattle herd. And there's a big difference in Canada and the US. So in Canada, we actually see that ratio at 41%, indicating there are signals now that the cattle herd in Canada might be starting to increase. So that's a good news story that we're seeing that, for people that are wondering about retail prices of beef, we're starting to see that signal happen. However, in the US, it's still about 49% through 2025. So the US, we're still not seeing those market signals. And so that's going to continue to support prices. So the bottom line is the cattle sector set up for another year of strong prices. We're seeing moderating feed costs. So it's going to really support profitability, cow-calf producers, as well as feedlots. I think, I've heard this is, some of the best times they've ever had from a profitability standpoint. So we are at the bottom of the cattle cycle. That contraction should be stopping. We might see some of that market, the early indicators, it's starting to increase in Canada. US, not so much yet, but we'll be watching this. And for sure, the one thing to note is even if we start to see that increase in the expansion in the US, it's going to take years. So the production cycle takes 2 to 3 years. So I guess bottom line is expect prices to be above that 5-year average, close to records, probably through 2026 and likely into 2027.
Yeah, and even if we were to start on an expansion, if you look at the pricing pattern in that first couple of years of an expansion, it's relatively flat, slightly declining. So you wouldn't lose much of the upside in prices if we were to start off a new expansion cycle. So thanks for that.